Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is May 8th, 2020. 75 years ago, today, all of Europe was freed from Nazi tyranny. It was a joyous day felt around the world. People celebrated. In the weeks prior to that, people came out from their homes using guns and whatever means necessary to take back their cities and their countryside. However, during World War II, armed brigades had fought the Nazis for 6 long years. These upstanders were called partisans. There were resistant partisan activity in every single country of occupied Europe. Many young people fled to the safety of England, where they were trained in spy activities, hand-to-hand combat, and espionage. 2 young men made their escape from occupied Czechoslovakia to England to train. They would undertake one of the most important acts of resistance during the Second World War. They will kill one of the most highest-ranking Nazi officials in the Third Reich, Reinhard Heydrich. These Czech boys, Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabček, basically were in England, and they wanted desperately to fight in World War II because their homeland had been invaded by the Nazis. So there were Poles, there were Czech, there were Belgians, there were French, and they were all in England training to fight back in Europe when the time came. Well, the time for these 2 men came in 1942. They were chosen on a very special mission. The government, the exiled government, the government that should have been the democratically elected government of Czechoslovakia, was hiding as well in England, and they decided that they needed an act of resistance. They were going to kill the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, which was Reinhard Heydrich. Reinhard Heydrich is known as the Butcher of Prague. You know him from your studies. He was an awful, awful man, brutal, and one of the architects of the final solution. Remember, he was the one who presided over the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942. About that time, ironically, these 2 men, Gabčík and Kubiš, were parachuted into Czechoslovakia. They missed their mark totally, and they had to make their way back to Prague, back to their resistance cells, where they would watch every day the street coming from Heydrich's residence and outskirts of Prague to the Prague castle, which he had his office. They waited, they planned, and they saw their move. You see, Heydrich, being the arrogant person that he was, the pompous man that he was, thought that he was a god over these Czechs, that no one would ever take a shot at him, so he rode in a convertible, an open convertible. Hitler chastised him constantly and said, "Heydrich, you've got to get a bulletproof car." And of course, he would have none of it. He said they wouldn't dare. So there Heydrich is, coming to and from work every day, and on the way to work, he came across this bend in the road. And the resistance fighters, Gabčík and Kubiš, they of course noticed that the car had to slow down at this certain curve and Holešova ulice every single day. So it was this day, May 27, 1942, that Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík decided to act. With a group of partisans, they decided to take Heydrich out at the corner. Using a Sten gun, one of them stepped forward and click, click, the gun jammed. Heydrich stood up, incredulous. He pointed his pistol. As he ran away, his partner stepped forward with the grenade and threw it. The grenade, in fact, did not go into the car, but exploded on the outside. It blasts on the outside of the car, knocking Heydrich back, but he's still able to get up and run after the perpetrators of this crime. Now, it's interesting because part of the blast went through the seats and into his spleen. So he got material from the seats and the blast in his spleen, and he would die of blood poisoning just a few days later in agony. Now, to this day, this is a very controversial thing, because in Czechoslovakia, after his death, there was a revenge. So everyone was very nervous. And indeed, in villages everywhere, people suffered. 2 villages were actually completely destroyed. All the male inhabitants of Lidice were killed, and the women and children relocated to concentration camps. it was a tragic time. And a lot of people think, should they have done this? Did it even make a difference? But these two men, they stood by what they did, and the Czech government stood by what they did because they said, we have to fight evil. You just do. You can't sit back and wait for it to end. These two men, unfortunately, and their crew hid in the basement of a church called St. Cyril Church on Reslava ulica in Prague, and they waited, and they waited where they could get out or how they could move. Unfortunately, one of the group who was parachuted in, he got nervous, and because he had a family, he was convinced that they'd be found out, so he went to the Gestapo and told them where he was. After that, they were cornered in the church. There was a gunfight, there was a gun battle. In fact, to this day, when you go by that church, you can still see the bullet holes in the side of the church. In the end, they started pumping water in them, and they tried to dig out to the sewer as best they could, but in the end, they took their own lives rather than being captured. So, to this day, it's one of the most dramatic, like Stauffenberg's, one of the most dramatic acts of resistance during the Second World War. So today of all days, ladies and gentlemen, remember those whose acts of resistance helped to end tyranny and oppression throughout Europe. This day, 75 years since the end of World War II. Study hard, don't panic, and be well.